The former nurse, now unemployed and lost, invited a homeless man to sit with her at the cafe. At dawn, a limousine pulled up in front of her door, and upon seeing who was waiting inside, she froze, leaving everyone around unsure of what would happen next. Clara sat inside a small cafe located at a quiet street corner in Atlanta. She had lost her nursing job at a local hospital just the day before, and she still felt stunned. Her body felt heavy, and her mind struggled to process what had happened. The cafe's interior looked modest, with no fancy decorations or modern furniture. There were a few wooden tables and chairs, some of them slightly wobbly. The late afternoon light came in through the windows, and outside, the wind was cold. Clara's hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that tasted bitter. She had not added sugar because she barely remembered to do so. She had chosen this place because it was simple and quiet. At that moment, she needed calm. She observed the room around her. There were only a few customers inside. A couple sat in a corner talking in low voices. Two older men at another table discussed something she could not quite hear. The walls had a worn-out paint job, and the counter looked older than she was. The smell of fresh coffee and warm bread drifted through the air. The scene was peaceful enough, but Clara could not relax. The simple wooden chairs, the dull overhead lights, and the faint scent of toasted bread contrasted with the tension in her chest. She felt as if the world outside was moving too fast, while she remained stuck in place. Yesterday, she had been wearing her nurse's badge with pride. She had woken up early before dawn, prepared a quick bowl of oatmeal, arranged her mother's medications in order, and then rushed out to the hospital. Her shifts were long, but she knew what was expected of her. She handled dressings, assisted doctors, comforted patients, and answered the questions of concerned relatives. There had been no mystery about who she was or what she did. She was a nurse. That identity made sense. Now everything felt uncertain. Clara lowered her eyes toward the coffee cup. She remembered the moment they told her the hospital was cutting positions. They wanted to reduce costs, and she was considered non-essential. They gave no proper reason other than financial constraints. A job she had worked so hard to secure and maintain was taken from her in a brief conversation. Now she was unemployed, and the bills would not stop coming. Most importantly, her mother depended on her. Her mother's heart condition required regular medication and frequent checkups. Without a steady income, Clara did not know how long she could provide the care her mother needed. The warmth inside the cafe, the soft background chatter, and the tempting smell of coffee beans and buttered toast could not erase the emptiness Clara felt. She tried to think of something positive. Perhaps she could find a new job soon. Maybe there were other hospitals in the city. But she knew there was a financial crisis affecting many healthcare institutions, and job openings were rare. The medical bills were expensive, and her mother's situation allowed no delays. This was not just about herself. It was about someone who needed her support. Clara stirred her coffee with a small spoon. Her mind searched for options. She thought about part-time home care services, maybe helping with medical administrative tasks somewhere. She had a few contacts, but everyone was stressed. Nobody had given her a lead yet. She felt the urge to stand up and do something, but what could she do right now? The future stretched out before her like an empty road. She felt tired, anxious, and worried all at once. Tomorrow seemed uncertain, and she could not ignore the fear growing inside her. Clara looked at the glass window near her table. The late afternoon light created a faint reflection, allowing her to see her own face. Without her nurse's uniform, without the familiar badge pinned to her shirt, she looked like a different person. Her hair was tied back in a careless way, and her eyes had dark circles beneath them. She tried to imagine herself as she had been 2 days ago, going through hospital corridors, speaking kindly to patients, and feeling a sense of purpose. Now, that version of herself seemed distant. Her mind returned to the practical concerns at hand. She had her rent due soon, utility bills waiting, and her mother's medical expenses were always a priority. How could she manage all this without a salary? Anxiety pressed against her thoughts. She needed to find a source of income, but the healthcare sector was not stable at the moment. The hospital that fired her had been known for cost-cutting measures recently. Many nurses and support staff were let go. The chance of quickly finding another stable nursing position looked slim. Without her job, she felt small and insignificant. She had chosen nursing not just for the paycheck, but also because it allowed her to help people. It gave her a role in society that mattered. Now she felt like a person who had lost an important part of her identity. She wondered if the hospital management ever thought about the human cost of their decisions. The administrators likely looked at spreadsheets, saw that cutting staff saved money, and never considered how it affected the lives of those who were dismissed. She thought back to the day they told her the hospital was letting her go. The person who delivered the news did not make eye contact. The words were polite but cold. It felt like being removed from a list, no questions asked. To them, she was probably just one more expense. She realized that in such systems, personal dedication and patient care often meant little compared to budgets and profit margins. Now she understood that the system considered nurses and other staff as replaceable parts. There was no real acknowledgement of the years she spent learning, improving her skills, and making patients more comfortable during their treatments. There was no appreciation for the nights she stayed awake or the countless emotional challenges she faced. In the end, it all came down to numbers. A sense of injustice filled her chest. She had worked honestly and treated patients with empathy, yet the institution discarded her without hesitation. She felt that this was not just about her. Many people were caught up in a system that did not reward compassion or loyalty. It just moved forward, crushing those who did not fit its profit calculations. Clara knew she had to survive on her own now. There would be no assistance from her former workplace. The healthcare industry was large, but she realized it could also be impersonal and unforgiving. Without an internal reference or a well-connected friend, finding a new job quickly would be hard. She considered smaller clinics or private practices, but the overall climate was challenging. A part of her wanted to fight back or complain, but who would listen? It was difficult to pinpoint a single enemy. The hospital that fired her acted out of financial necessity, or so they claimed. The healthcare system as a whole often favored efficiency over human factors. The social environment did not guarantee stable support for individuals who lost their jobs. She was facing a combination of impersonal forces working against her. It was hard to know where to direct her frustration. Sitting in the cafe, Clara realized she had to deal with this new reality. She was an unemployed nurse in a city that barely noticed her existence. There was no time to dwell on the past. She had to think about what she could do next. But at this very moment, she only knew that the road ahead was unclear. She finished her coffee and placed the cup gently on the small saucer. Outside, cars passed by. Pedestrians rushed home and life went on as if nothing had changed. For Clara, everything was different now. Clara remained in the cafe for several more minutes. Her mind drifted back to a painful memory that she rarely allowed herself to revisit. It was the time her father fell ill with cancer years ago. She had been a nursing student then, eager to learn and do something meaningful. He had stayed for weeks in the same hospital where she later worked, and she had watched helplessly as he struggled against the disease. She saw firsthand how the system operated under stress. The doctors were tired, the nurses overloaded, and expensive medications were hard to secure. In the end, he passed away, and Clara never forgot the feeling of powerlessness she experienced. That event had motivated her to become a nurse who would treat patients with understanding and care. But now, as she sat unemployed, she felt the same sense of helplessness creeping back in. The memory weighed on her heart. It reminded her that the system could fail anyone at any time. Even her family had not escaped. Becoming a nurse had been her way of fighting back against that sense of loss. She wanted to be part of the solution. Now she was on the outside, wondering if she had ever really made a difference. Her phone vibrated inside her bag, interrupting her thoughts. She hesitated before checking it. The screen showed a message from the pharmacy, where she usually got her mother's medications. They reminded her that the last invoice was overdue. The polite but firm tone indicated no flexibility. Without a steady income, these expenses would pile up quickly. She also thought about the upcoming rent and the utilities that would soon need to be paid. The landlord was not known for patience. Clara pushed her coffee cup aside and considered her options. She had some savings, but they were modest and would not last long. Could she find a quick side job? Perhaps she could clean houses or take care of someone else's elderly family member for a small fee. But that might not cover everything. The hospital had been a stable source of income. Now all she saw were temporary, low-paying tasks that would keep her afloat for a short time. The thought of explaining all this to her mother made her uncomfortable. Her mother depended on her, and Clara had always tried to shield her from stress. But now, it seemed impossible. There was no one to blame specifically. The hospital management did what they thought was necessary. Other nurses and support staff were also affected. Her few friends from work were just as worried about their future. Everyone was focused on their own struggles. Clara felt a mixture of shame and fear. Shame for not having a better plan, fear of what would happen if she failed. She had always prided herself on being responsible. It was who she was. Now she had to consider unpleasant options, selling belongings, delaying some treatments, or trying to negotiate with creditors. Each idea felt like a failure. She stirred her cold coffee again, even though she knew it would not help. As day turned into early evening, Clara looked around the cafe once more. Through the window, she saw people walking outside, some in a hurry, others pausing to check their phones. Then she noticed a man standing just outside the window. He wore old, dirty clothes, a worn-out jacket, and he seemed to be staring at the inside of the cafe. His eyes were fixed on the food and the cups of coffee. He looked hungry. Clara recognized the look. It was the look of someone who felt excluded from comfort and warmth. She had not noticed him before, but now he was hard to ignore. He stood close to the door but did not enter. Perhaps he had no money, or maybe he felt unwelcome. Clara thought of her own situation. She was not homeless, not yet, but she understood what it was like to feel lost. Impulsively, she raised a hand and motioned for the man to come inside. He hesitated, looking around as if unsure she meant him. She nodded, encouraging him. Slowly, he opened the door and approached her table. Other customers glanced over but said nothing. Clara pointed to the chair opposite hers and asked him to sit down. The man's name was Edward. He spoke softly, as if unused to conversations. He thanked her for the seat and admitted he was hungry. Without hesitation, Clara signaled the server and ordered a small meal for him, a sandwich and a cup of coffee. It was not expensive, but she felt the weight of every dollar spent. Still, something inside her would not let her ignore this man's need. Maybe helping someone else would remind her of who she was before this crisis. As Edward ate, he told her a bit about his life. He said he once had a family and a good business, but he lost everything after a series of unfortunate events. He hinted that it was related to trust, bad decisions, and a shift in the people around him. Clara listened, not judging him. She offered no grand advice, only a listening ear. She knew what it felt like to have the ground pulled out from beneath you. She did not expect anything in return. She only knew that this act of kindness was consistent with the values that led her to become a nurse. If she could not solve her own problems right now, at least she could bring a small comfort to someone else. This thought eased the tension in her chest. Edward thanked her more than once. He said he appreciated her generosity, especially since it seemed she herself was not in the best situation. Clara shrugged and said that sometimes people had to help one another, even in tough times. She did not realize it at that moment, but by inviting him to her table, she had set in motion events that would change the course of her life. The next morning, Clara woke up feeling a familiar weight pressing on her mind. She had returned home after meeting Edward, feeling slightly better about herself, but still worried about the future. She had spent the night thinking about finding at least some temporary job. She was prepared to walk around the city, look for signs in windows, ask around, and do anything honest that could bring in some income. As she got dressed in her small apartment, she suddenly heard a vehicle stopping outside. It was an unusual sound for her quiet street. She went to the window and peeked through the curtains. To her shock, a long black limousine was parked right outside her building. She could see a driver in a dark suit standing by the passenger door. She could not imagine who it was for. Curious and apprehensive, Clara stepped outside. She expected the driver to wave her away, but instead, he opened the passenger door and nodded at her. Confused, she walked closer. Inside the limousine, sitting with calm confidence, was Edward. But he looked completely different. He wore a clean, tailored suit, and his hair was neatly styled. He smiled at her and invited her to join him in the car. Clara hesitated. This made no sense. Yesterday, Edward had been standing outside a cafe, looking like a man with nothing to his name. Now he was acting like a person of wealth and influence. She looked around, wondering if this was some kind of prank. But the driver waited patiently, and Edward continued smiling. Against her better judgment, Clara got into the limousine, choosing the seat across from Edward. He thanked her for her kindness the day before and admitted that he had not told her the whole truth. He said he was once a wealthy businessman who lost his faith in people after a series of personal betrayals. He decided to test human kindness by living on the streets for a while, seeing if anyone would treat him with dignity. Clara listened in disbelief. She did not know what to say. Edward continued, explaining that her small gesture of empathy at the cafe meant more to him than she could know. He saw her struggle, yet she still offered to help him. He appreciated that deeply. Now he wanted to return the favor by offering her a job at a charitable foundation he managed. The sudden turn of events left Clara speechless. A day ago, she was desperate for solutions. Now an offer of employment appeared out of nowhere. She wanted to ask many questions, but Edward kept talking. He described the foundation as a serious, well-funded organization dedicated to helping people in need. He suggested that she could work there, ensuring a stable income, and also providing financial help for her mother's medical care. Clara felt both relief and suspicion. She asked him why he had to trick people into proving their kindness. Edward answered that after years in business, he could no longer trust others. He wanted to find someone who acted with compassion without expecting a reward. Clara tried to understand, but it felt odd and unsettling. Edward said he would take her to the foundation's office, show her around, and present a contract. He made it sound simple and safe. Clara agreed, feeling she should see it before committing. The limousine drove through the city until they reached a large building in a respectable district. Inside, she observed well-dressed staff at desks, computers running smoothly, and well-lit hallways. Everything looked professional and serious. But as she moved through the offices, Clara felt something was off. The staff members were polite but distant. Their smiles did not reach their eyes. When she asked general questions, they gave short, guarded answers. The atmosphere seemed controlled, as if nobody wanted to say anything beyond their scripted roles. When Clara met a few of the managers, they complimented Edward's vision. They spoke highly of the charity work, but mentioned rules and procedures in a way that sounded rigid and limiting. Clara began to suspect that accepting this position might mean signing away some of her autonomy. Although Edward's offer would solve her financial problems, something did not sit right with her. After the brief tour, Edward presented a contract. Clara started to read it carefully, He urged her to trust his good intentions. But the language was complicated. It seemed to require a high level of commitment, strict conditions, and possibly restrictions on her personal freedom. She paused, feeling uncomfortable. Edward frowned slightly when Clara asked if she could have more time to think. He said he understood her caution, but hinted that his offer would not remain open for long. That sudden pressure bothered Clara. Why the rush? Clara decided not to sign right away. She thanked Edward for the opportunity and said she needed at least a day or two to consider. He nodded, but she noticed the disappointment in his eyes. Once back in the limousine, the ride home felt colder. Edward said he would wait for her decision, but his tone had changed. There was less warmth, as if her hesitation had offended him. When they arrived at her apartment, Clara stepped out and thanked him again. He nodded and told her to contact him soon. The limousine drove away quietly, leaving her standing on the sidewalk. She felt uneasy, uncertain about whether she had almost escaped a trap or missed a real chance to rebuild her life. At least for now, she had no clear answers. Clara arrived home late in the afternoon. She had expected to feel relieved after leaving Edward's limousine behind, but instead she felt uneasy. She had no concrete solution to her problems and no certainty about what Edward's offer really meant. Before climbing the stairs to her apartment, she paused and took a deep breath. She tried to think calmly. She needed to check on her mother, review her finances, and somehow find a way forward. When Clara reached the apartment door, she noticed something was wrong. The door was slightly open, and there were scratch marks near the lock. Her heart sank. She slowly pushed the door open and stepped inside. Her small living room had been disturbed. Some papers lay scattered across the floor. A few drawers were open. She rushed into her bedroom and checked if anything valuable was missing. It was hard to tell at first, but she realized that most of her personal items were still there. It looked more like someone had searched through her belongings than tried to steal something. Alarmed, she checked on her mother, who was resting in her bedroom. Her mother was awake and frightened. She said she had heard noises but felt too weak to get up. Clara tried to reassure her, but her own voice trembled. Who would break into their home? They had nothing expensive. This intrusion felt more like a warning or a message. Clara called the police, explaining what had happened. 2 officers arrived about an hour later. They looked around, took notes, and asked if Clara had any enemies. She could not give them a clear answer. They did not seem very concerned. They said that maybe it was just a petty criminal looking for something easy to grab. They offered no special protection. Clara felt disappointed as they left. After the police were gone, Clara tried to restore some order. She picked up the scattered papers from the floor. Bills, hospital receipts, and some letters were all over the place. It seemed the intruder had gone through her financial documents. This was strange. Why would a random thief care about those? This event made her think about Edward and the strange pressure he exerted. Could he or someone working for him have done this? It felt paranoid to assume such a thing, but the timing was too perfect. Right after she hesitated to accept his offer, her apartment was invaded. She had no proof, though, and accusing him made no sense without evidence. Clara decided not to mention Edward to her mother. Her mother was already anxious and in poor health. Instead, Clara said it was probably a simple break-in with no real target. Her mother did not look convinced. She knew her daughter was hiding something, but she was too tired to argue. Later that evening, Clara tried to call an old friend from the hospital, hoping for some emotional support or advice. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried another co-worker's number, but there was no answer. She knew many of them were also struggling after the layoffs. Everyone had their own problems now. She felt more alone than ever. Clara was stuck in a confusing situation. She did not trust Edward's sudden offer, but what other options did she have? Finding a job would not be simple. Even part-time home care might not pay enough to cover her mother's medication and the rent. She sat down at the kitchen table and tried to list possible solutions. Nothing seemed good enough. Every idea felt too small or unreliable. The apartment felt less safe now. She double-checked the door lock and closed all the windows. She worried that whoever broke in might return. If this was meant to scare her, it was working. She felt exposed and unsure whom to trust. Her mother asked a few gentle questions. She wanted to know if Clara had found a new job or if there was any news about the hospital. Clara tried to remain calm. She said she was still looking, that times were tough, and that she had some possible leads. It was not a complete lie, but it was not the full truth either. Her mother deserved honesty, but Clara feared burdening her with details about Edward or the strange conditions of the job he had offered. With no one to guide her, Clara faced a sense of isolation. The world outside the apartment seemed hostile, and now even her home felt violated. She knew she needed to make a decision soon. The apartment break-in was a reminder that waiting and doing nothing could have consequences. She considered calling Edward to ask more questions. If he truly wanted to help, he might understand her hesitation. But she remembered his disappointed look when she did not sign the contract immediately. He might not be so patient now. Still, was it worth risking her freedom and peace of mind for a stable paycheck? As the night grew late, Clara lay awake in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind ran through scenarios. If she accepted Edward's offer, she could secure her mother's medical needs and pay the bills. But what would she owe in return? If she refused, could she handle more intrusions, more threats? She had no solid evidence Edward was behind this, but her instincts told her not to dismiss the possibility. By dawn, she was exhausted, but no closer to a solution. She rose quietly and made herself a cup of tea. She thought about her father's memory, the reason she became a nurse, and how much she valued helping others. Now she might become involved with a powerful man whose motives were unclear. She was caught in a difficult position with no easy answers. Clara entered the next day feeling drained. She had slept poorly and still had no plan. She knew the rent would soon be overdue. The pharmacy had sent another reminder about unpaid medications, and the bills stacked up on her desk. The break-in made her feel unsafe, and she worried about her mother's health. Everything seemed to push her toward a breaking point. She tried to find small, odd jobs around the neighborhood that morning. She asked at a nearby grocery store if they needed help stacking shelves. The manager said they were not hiring. She visited a local clinic to see if they needed a part-time assistant, but they had no openings. Every attempt ended in disappointment. By midday, Clara returned to her apartment feeling defeated. She sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the wall. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she tried to hold them back. She needed a clear head. She was close to giving up. Maybe she would have to accept Edward's offer no matter what it involved. At least it would solve the financial problems, and maybe the strange harassment would stop. At that moment, she heard a slight sound near the door. She got up and checked. An envelope had been slipped under her door. There was no name, no return address. Clara picked it up carefully and opened it. Inside, there was a short typed message. "Stop refusing good opportunities. People like you need to know their place." Her heart pounded. This felt like a direct threat, as if someone knew she was hesitating. It was not just a random break-in after all. Someone was pressuring her to comply. This confirmed her worst suspicions. She had no proof it was connected to Edward, but the timing was perfect. Who else knew about the job offer and her reluctance to sign? Now Clara's fear rose to a new level. This was not just economic pressure. It was a moral and physical intimidation. She realized that giving up her independence would be easy if she could protect her mother and herself. But at what cost? Becoming indebted to someone who tested her kindness with lies and now possibly scared her into obedience sounded horrible. Yet what choice did she have? Her phone buzzed. It was the pharmacy again. They demanded payment or they would stop providing medicine. She had no money left. She could delay the rent a little, but soon the landlord would come knocking. She could not ignore this situation. The anonymous note proved that waiting would only invite more threats. Clara considered going to the police again with the note, but what could they do? Last time they barely took any interest. Without a known suspect, they might dismiss this as a prank. She had no friends nearby who could help, and no family other than her mother. She felt trapped. She spent the afternoon pacing the apartment, trying to calm down. She thought about her father again. He had taught her to stand up for what was right, but he was gone, and she had to face reality. She could not let her mother suffer because of her pride. Still, the idea of working under fear and manipulation made her stomach turn. The day passed slowly. By evening, Clara was on the verge of making a decision she would not have imagined a week ago. She leaned against the kitchen counter and stared at the silent phone. Maybe if she called Edward, he would be gentle and understanding. Maybe he would explain things more clearly. Or maybe he would show his true face as a man who used pressure to get what he wanted. Before doing anything, Clara decided to try one last time to find a safe alternative. She searched online job boards, local community groups, and even posted a small ad offering her services as a caregiver. Hours passed and no responses came. It was getting dark, and her phone remained silent. The envelope with the threatening note lay on the table, a reminder that someone was watching her decisions. Clara knew she was near the breaking point. Without income, her mother's health would decline. Without proper medication, her mother's condition could worsen quickly. Clara could not ignore that. She had no savings left to bridge the gap. Every option seemed bad, but some were worse than others. By nightfall, Clara's head ached. She realized that her initial thought of becoming a nurse to help others did not prepare her for a situation where she had no leverage and no allies. The world around her seemed to operate on power and intimidation. She felt like a small piece in a larger game that she did not understand. She looked at her sleeping mother, who was unaware of the full extent of the crisis. Clara wanted to protect her, to keep a roof over their heads, and to ensure proper medical care. But doing so might mean sacrificing her own integrity. The letter had made it clear that someone wanted her to understand her place. It was a cruel reminder that not everyone respected kindness and empathy. As she turned off the lights in the living room and walked to her bedroom, Clara realized she could not linger in indecision much longer. The moment to choose was approaching. She did not know if she could live with herself if she gave in, but she also did not know if she could survive if she resisted. Either way, her future looked grim, and she had never felt so alone. The next morning, Clara woke up feeling weak and tired. She had not slept well, and the stress was making her body ache. She checked on her mother, who seemed stable for the moment, but needed more medication soon. The rent was due in 2 days. The pharmacy had warned her repeatedly, and the landlord was known for his lack of patience. She spent the early morning hours trying to think of a last-minute solution. She considered calling distant relatives, but she had almost no family left. She looked through online ads again, but nothing suitable appeared. The time was running out, and each passing moment increased the pressure. Around mid-morning, Clara heard a knock at the door. She froze, worried it might be another threat or someone from Edward's circle. When she opened it, she saw her landlord standing there with his arms crossed. He was a stern man in his early 50s who rarely showed sympathy. He reminded Clara that the rent was overdue and that he would not wait much longer. She tried to explain that she lost her job and was looking for a solution, but he only shook his head. He said if she could not pay by the deadline, she would have to leave. Clara closed the door, holding back tears. She had 2 days to find the money. Even if she accepted Edward's offer immediately, would he cover her costs that fast? She doubted it. She considered reaching out to him and trying to negotiate some urgent help, but the idea of begging him made her feel uncomfortable. She was trapped between pride and survival. By noon, Clara received another phone call from the pharmacy. This time, the person on the line sounded impatient. They warned that without payment, they would cancel her orders. Clara tried to reason with them, explaining the situation, but they did not care. It was business, not charity. She hung up and looked at the empty wall in front of her. Every path seemed blocked. With each hour, the tension rose. Clara had to think about what mattered most. Her mother's health was the top priority. Without medication, her mother could face serious complications. Losing the apartment would leave them homeless. The threats and the break-in suggested that refusing Edward might lead to more dangers. But accepting his offer might mean losing her independence and entering a situation she could not control. Later in the afternoon, Clara received a message on her phone. It was from Edward. He stated that time was passing and that he needed her decision. He said he understood her caution, but he could not wait forever. He hinted that the opportunity he offered was a rare chance for someone in her position. Clara read and reread the message, feeling a chill. He was pushing her toward a choice, and she knew it. Now it felt like an impossible crisis. All factors were lining up against her. The rent deadline, the medication, the intimidation, and Edward's pressure combined to create a situation where no decision seemed good. Clara's heart pounded as she realized that she could not delay much longer. As night approached, Clara paced the living room floor. Her mother rested in the bedroom, unaware of the full extent of the crisis. Clara knew that if she explained everything, her mother would worry herself sick. She wanted to protect her mother from fear, but protecting her now required resources she did not have. Clara considered the possibility of running away. If she left the city, would she find a cheaper place to live, a chance to rebuild? But she had no savings to start over somewhere else. Also, her mother's medical condition required regular care and medication. Running would not solve anything. The pressure reached its peak. Clara realized this was the turning point. She remembered her father's illness, her dedication as a nurse, and her values. She had always been proud of acting with integrity. Now, could she live with herself if she surrendered to Edward under suspicious conditions? On the other hand, could she stand by and watch everything fall apart if she refused? By late evening, she felt trapped in her own thoughts. The silence in the apartment pressed on her shoulders. She tried to imagine herself signing Edward's contract, working at his foundation, and following his rules. Would she be able to sleep at night, knowing she had entered into an arrangement born out of fear and pressure? Or would it be better to hold on to her dignity and risk losing almost everything else? Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. She knew that by the next morning she would have to move in one direction or the other. The weight of this decision was unlike anything she had faced before. She stared at her phone, half expecting another message or call that would force her hand. The final hours of the night were filled with tension and doubt. Clara understood now that she was at the highest point of stress. The situation had become impossible. She had no allies, no savings, and no time. All she had was her own moral compass and the knowledge that once she chose a path, she might not be able to turn back. At sunrise, Clara stood in front of the mirror in her small bathroom. She looked at her tired eyes and pale face. She felt a strange calmness spreading through her body. The night had forced her to confront her core values. She realized that if she sacrificed her principles for security, she would feel ashamed. Her entire career as a nurse had been about helping people with kindness and honesty. How could she let go of that now? This morning, Clara made a decision. She would not call Edward. She would not accept his offer. She would face the consequences of poverty and find a way to survive without selling her dignity. She was not sure how she would do it, but she knew she would try. Her mother's well-being was at risk, but Clara hoped to find small jobs, even if they paid less, to at least buy some medications and keep a roof over their heads for a bit longer. She stepped outside and began her search. She walked through several neighborhoods, looking for signs that read, "Help Wanted." She asked in small shops, restaurants, and stores. For hours she heard the same response. No vacancies or not hiring right now. She felt discouraged, but she kept going. Around midday, Clara entered a small family-owned restaurant. The place smelled of spices and warm bread. There were only a few tables, and it looked like a modest operation. She approached the woman at the counter and asked if they needed any help. The woman looked at her suspiciously at first, then asked what kind of work Clara could do. Clara said she could wash dishes, clean tables, or help in the kitchen. She was willing to do anything. The woman hesitated, then said she could try Clara out for the afternoon. It was not official employment, just a temporary test. Clara agreed, grateful for the chance. She rolled up her sleeves and went to the kitchen, where she started washing dishes and wiping counters. The work was simple but tiring. Water splashed over her arms. Her hands turned red from the scrubbing, and her back ached after a few hours. By the end of the day, the woman gave Clara a small amount of money for her work. It was not enough to solve her financial problems, but it was something. Clara thanked her and asked if she could return the next day. The woman nodded, not promising a permanent job, but at least giving Clara hope for another day's work. With the money in her pocket, Clara headed to a local discount pharmacy. She explained her situation and asked if she could buy a smaller supply of her mother's medication. She managed to purchase enough pills to last a few days, using the little money she had earned. It was not perfect, but it would keep her mother stable for now. When Clara returned home, she felt exhausted, but less defeated. She had refused to give in to intimidation. She had taken a difficult stand, and now she was dealing with the harsh reality of low-paying work and uncertain prospects. Yet, she felt a sense of pride. She had chosen to maintain her dignity. She might struggle more, but at least she would not be trapped under someone else's power. She checked on her mother, who was sleeping comfortably. Clara gave her the medication at the proper time and made a simple soup for dinner. Outside, the sky turned dark, but inside, Clara felt a quiet strength. She understood now that life would be challenging, but she could face it without giving up who she was. This choice did not solve all her problems. She still had to pay the rent soon, still had bills piling up, and there was no guarantee the restaurant would keep giving her small tasks. However, she had taken action. She refused to let fear dictate her choices. If Edward or his associates were watching, they would see that she could not be forced into compliance. That night, Clara lay down with a sore body, but her mind was calmer. She had found a path forward that aligned with her own values. There was no illusion that it would be easy. She knew she would have to fight for every bit of stability. But for the first time in days, she felt like she was standing on solid ground. She would survive, and she would do it on her own terms. Over the next few days, Clara returned to the small restaurant early each morning. She washed more dishes, scrubbed floors, and occasionally helped prepare basic ingredients in the kitchen. Her hands became dry and rough, and her back often ached, but she did not complain. She knew this work was honest and allowed her to earn enough money to purchase a little more medication for her mother and keep some food on the table. The situation was far from ideal, but Clara felt steady. She had refused to give in to Edward's offer, and she was proud of that choice. In the evenings, Clara carefully managed her limited funds. She counted out what she earned each day and divided it between rent, medicine, and groceries. It was never enough to feel secure, but at least she was not falling further into debt. When her mother needed a refill on medication, Clara would buy the smallest possible quantity, just enough to maintain stability. She also tried to negotiate with the pharmacy for small discounts or payment plans. Sometimes the pharmacist showed a bit of understanding, sometimes not. But Clara kept trying. She thought often about her former life as a nurse in the hospital. She remembered caring for patients with compassion and skill, feeling useful and respected. Now she was washing dishes for a living. It was a difficult adjustment, but she tried not to dwell on what she had lost. Instead, she focused on the present tasks and her immediate responsibilities. She understood that her sense of worth did not depend on wearing a nurse's uniform. Her worth came from her actions and her choices. One afternoon, after finishing her shift at the restaurant, Clara returned home and found her mother awake and alert. Her mother noticed the tired look on her daughter's face and asked how the job search was going. Clara was honest and said she had found temporary work in a restaurant's kitchen. Her mother looked worried, knowing this meant Clara was working far below her qualifications, but she also sensed Clara's determination. Clara did not mention Edward or the threats she had faced. She wanted to spare her mother that stress. It was better to let her think that this was just a rough patch they would overcome. Clara realized that, despite her difficult situation, she felt a certain calm. She was no longer waiting for a sudden miracle or dreading a forced decision. She had chosen a path and was following it, step by step. She learned to stretch her few earnings as far as they would go. She bought simple groceries, rice, beans, vegetables, and occasionally some chicken. She cooked simple meals at home to ensure her mother had proper nutrition. When the landlord came by to remind her about the rent, Clara did not panic. She calmly explained she was working and would pay something soon. The landlord still looked unhappy, but Clara managed to give him a small partial payment. It was not enough to settle everything, but it bought her a little more time. As long as she made some effort, he would hold off on eviction, at least for now. Clara also tried to see if she could find a small side job in the neighborhood. One day after her restaurant shift, she asked a local shop owner if they needed evening help. They did not, but another customer overheard and mentioned that a neighbor needed someone to help clean her home once a week. Clara took the neighbor's number and planned to call the next morning. It was a small lead, but every extra bit of income might help. The hardest part was not knowing if this situation would improve. Clara accepted that she might have to live this way for a while. She still dreamed of returning to nursing one day, maybe after the economic conditions changed, or after she saved enough money to renew her certifications or look for jobs in smaller clinics. Until then, she had to be patient. She also noticed that, as time passed, Edward did not contact her again. She heard nothing more from him or his associates. The threats had stopped, and the unsettling feeling of being watched had faded. Perhaps, after seeing her refusal, they moved on and focused on something else. Clara did not want to think too much about it. She was grateful that no further harm had come from that strange encounter. At the restaurant, the owner slowly grew more comfortable with Clara's presence. Sometimes she allowed Clara to help with simple cooking tasks, chopping vegetables or seasoning soups. Clara learned quickly and performed her duties without complaint. While the pay remained low, it became a slightly more stable arrangement. It was unglamorous, but it was honest work that kept them going. At night, Clara gave her mother the necessary medication and checked her condition. Knowing she could still provide basic care brought a sense of purpose. She might not wear a nurse's badge, but she was still caring for someone who depended on her. Her skills and her empathy were not lost. They were just applied in a different context now. As more weeks passed, Clara adapted to her new routine. Each morning she woke up before the sun rose, prepared a cup of tea for her mother, and left to work at the restaurant. She saved every bit of money she could. When she had a small surplus, she bought her mother's medication in slightly larger quantities, ensuring a more stable supply. She continued to look for additional small tasks, sometimes cleaning a neighbor's apartment for a modest fee. Over time, people in the neighborhood began to recognize her. They saw her heading to the restaurant each day, carrying groceries home in the evening, and sometimes stopping by the pharmacy or market. She was not close friends with anyone, but she exchanged polite greetings with a few regular customers at the restaurant or people she passed on the street. These small gestures were not much, but they reminded Clara that she was part of a community, even if it was on a small scale. Her mother noticed Clara's persistence and determination. She remarked that Clara seemed calmer and more grounded than when she first lost her job. Clara explained that she understood now that life could change suddenly, and the best she could do was adapt without losing her values. Although her mother still wished Clara could return to nursing one day, she respected the choices Clara was making under difficult circumstances. Clara thought less and less about Edward. At first, she had worried that he might reappear to pressure her or punish her for refusing his offer. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into a routine, he faded into the background of her memory. Clara saw him now as a test she had faced and passed. She had chosen her own path, rejecting easy solutions that came with strings attached. She learned that her moral principles were worth defending. Without Edward's interference, Clara focused on improving her daily life. She learned to cook cheap but nutritious meals, how to budget carefully, and how to negotiate small discounts with the pharmacy and grocery store. These were not pleasant skills to develop under pressure, but they helped her survive. The stability she achieved was fragile, but it was hers. She did not rely on anyone's charity or manipulations. She earned her money through work. Her mother's health remained stable, and the home, though modest, was still theirs for now. Clara learned to accept her situation and find meaning in small victories, paying a bill on time, buying medication without skipping doses, making her mother laugh with a simple joke during dinner. In quiet moments, Clara remembered her time as a nurse. She thought about the skills she had gained and the compassion she had shown to patients. She promised herself that one day, if the opportunity arose, she would return to that profession or a similar role. For now, she needed to focus on survival. She did not give up hope, but she understood that hope alone would not pay the bills. As time passed, Clara proved to herself that she could endure hardship without sacrificing her principles. She had no illusions that life would suddenly become easy, but she knew she had the strength to face challenges. She had protected her mother's well-being and kept a roof over their heads. She had not allowed fear or intimidation to control her decisions. On a quiet evening, after finishing her chores at the restaurant, Clara returned home with some fresh bread and a small piece of cheese for dinner. Her mother smiled at the sight of these simple treats. They sat together at the small kitchen table, eating slowly, enjoying each other's company. Outside, the city hummed quietly. Inside, they had what they needed for that day. Clara realized that this was her new normal, working small jobs, paying attention to every expense, and caring for her mother's health. It was not the life she had envisioned, but it was an honest life, built on her own choices. She felt no shame in her struggles, only a sense of dignity in knowing she had refused to let others define her worth. As night fell, Clara prepared her mother's medication and made sure she was comfortable. Then she checked the locks on the door and the windows, feeling a certain peace. She remembered the fear and confusion that had gripped her weeks before and compared it to how she felt now. She was not wealthy or secure, but she was true to herself. That counted for something. With that understanding, Clara lay down to rest. She closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow would be another day of hard work and careful planning. But she would face it without regrets. She had chosen a path guided by honesty and self-respect, and that was the life she now lived. The future remained uncertain, yet she had learned that her own strength and integrity were the best tools she had to navigate it.